The desperate aliens' blade-like fingers clawed at their chains as the invaders hauled them towards the blood-drenched altar, the Romulan girls shrieking for the miracle they knew would never come. That was when a human dropship split the smoke-choked sky. Laros, the captured Romulan leader, lifted her head at the sound, hope kindling in her eyes as a lone figure in black tactical gear fast-roped down from the hovering dropship, assault rifle blazing. This was the human Carl Bailey, a battle-hardened ex-Special Forces mercenary hired by Laros's father in a final desperate bid to save his people from slavery and death. But Carl had arrived to an apocalyptic scene. The Romulan cities lay in ruins, the population already in chains. The peaceful Romulans, lacking advanced weapons or combat experience, had been rapidly overwhelmed by the vicious Dragath invaders. Their civilization teetered on the razor's edge between slavery and extinction. Carl moved with ruthless precision towards the enemy stronghold, where Laros and the other captives were being held for sacrifice. The clock was ticking before the Dragath performed their twisted blood ritual to empower their dark gods, which would spell certain doom for the galaxy. Fighting through waves of snarling Dragath warriors, Carl stormed the ritual chamber in a hail of gunfire, determined to prevent the sacrifice of Laros and rescue the prisoners from a fate worse than death. But even as the broken chains hit the floor and the Dragath leader's corpse slid off Carl's gore-slick combat knife, the grim truth became clear. The forces Carl had just decimated were a mere scouting party for the main Dragath invasion fleet, and those warships would descend on the crippled Romulans in mere days, against which they stood no chance alone. Carl gripped his rifle, jaw set. He would summon his fellow human mercenaries and train a Romulan resistance force. The Romulans would make their last stand, buying time until Carl's outfit arrived. It was a desperate gambit, but the only hope to save an entire alien race from being engulfed by the pitiless darkness between the stars. As the smoke from the battle cleared, Carl wasted no time in preparing the Romulans for the greater war to come. He spent long days training them in guerrilla tactics, marksmanship, and hand-to-hand combat. The Romulans proved quick studies, their lithe forms and keen senses well suited for the hit-and-run warfare Carl had in mind. During a break in training, Laros pulled Carl aside, her luminous eyes filled with pain. She revealed the true extent of the Zorgon's cruelty. Beyond enslaving the Romulans for labor, the invaders were abducting Romulan women and girls to serve as sacrifices in their dark rituals. "My own sister is among the captives," Laros said, her voice cracking. "They are being held at a fortified base on the far side of the planet." Carl's lips pursed. He knew rescuing those prisoners would strike a critical blow against the Zorgons. Not only would it deprive them of victims for their vile ceremonies, but it would also give the beleaguered Romulans a much-needed jolt of hope. That night, Carl gathered his most promising trainees and outlined a plan to infiltrate the Zorgon base. They would use the darkness as cover, slipping past the perimeter defenses to reach the holding cells. As the twin moons rose over the shattered cityscape, Carl and his hand-picked squad moved out. They ghosted through the shadows, bypassing Zorgon patrols with whisper-quiet efficiency. At the base's electrified fence, Carl made short work of the locking mechanism with a localized EMP burst. Inside the compound, the team split up, placing breaching charges at key junctions. On Carl's signal, the explosives detonated in unison, sowing chaos among the Zorgon guards. Blaster fire lit up the night as Carl and the Romulans charged in. They swiftly cut down the disoriented sentries and raced into the detention block. The sight that greeted them turned Carl's stomach. Dozens of Romulan females, many just teenagers, huddled in filthy cages, their once lustrous skin mottled with bruises. Carl blasted open the locks and the Romulans rushed in to free the captives, draping them in cloaks and supporting those too weak to walk. Just as they hurried towards the exit, alarms blared throughout the compound. A tide of heavily armed Zorgons poured into the cell block, blocking their escape. Carl knew they were out of time and options. He shoved Laros towards the exit, yelling for her to lead the others to the extraction point. Then he turned to face the oncoming horde, a blaster in one hand and a serrated combat knife in the other. "I'll hold them off," he growled, Get those people out of here! What followed was a desperate rearguard action as Carl battled the Zorgons, his knife flashing and blaster blazing. He fought like a man possessed, the blood of slain invaders soon coating the floor. But for each foe he cut down, 3 more seemed to take their place. Carl's blaster clicked empty, and he hurled it at a charging Zorgon, caving in the brute's skull. He fell back down the smoke-filled corridor, trading vicious knife thrusts and bone-crunching strikes with the relentless enemy. A clawed hand seized his ankle and Carl stumbled. The Zorgons swarmed him like jackals, pummeling him with merciless blows that cracked ribs and split flesh. Through a red haze of pain, Carl saw Laros and the last of the prisoners vanish into the night. A faint smile tugged at his split lips. The captives were free. Then a Zorgon boot slammed into his temple and the world went black. Carl awoke in chains, his wounds roughly bandaged. The leering face of the Zorgon commander swam into focus, flanked by a coterie of guards. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, human," the commander rasped. "But you'll soon wish I'd let you die. When the fleet arrives with our supreme leader, you will be the centerpiece of our victory celebration, a long, slow sacrifice to the hungering gods." The Zorgons laughed, drunk on imagined triumph. But despite the agony pulsing through his battered body, Carl almost pitied them. They had no idea of the ace he still had in play. High above the planet, at the very edges of the system, the vanguard ships of Carl's mercenary fleet flashed out of warp, an armada of battle-scarred frigates and destroyers crewed by the meanest brigands credits could buy. Veterans of a dozen dirty wars, they owed Carl blood debts that went beyond money. And they had come to collect, setting the stage for a final, savage conflagration that would determine the fate of the Romulans and the entire galaxy. Carl's head snapped back as another blow landed. Blood and spit flew from his mouth, splattering the grimy floor of the interrogation chamber. The Zorgon commander loomed over him, jagged teeth bared in a vicious grin. "Where are the rest of your forces, human?" the commander snarled. Carl spat a glob of blood onto the Zorgon's boots. "Go to hell." The commander raised his fist for another strike when the room shook violently. Alarms blared throughout the base. "Sir," a Zorgon soldier burst into the chamber. "Human ships, they're engaging our fleet." In orbit, Commander Jake Steele stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Retribution. "All ships engage at will. Let's show these bastards how humans fight." The mercenary fleet tore into the Zorgon armada. Plasma torpedoes and laser fire crisscrossed the void. Jake's lips curled into a predatory grin as he watched a Zorgon cruiser erupt into a fireball. On the planet's surface, Laros crouched behind a pile of rubble, peering at the Zorgon base through a pair of binoculars. A Romulan resistance fighter crawled up beside her. "The human fleet has arrived," he whispered. "It's time." Laros nodded grimly. "For Carl." She raised her hand, and dozens of Romulans emerged from hiding. They surged towards the base, makeshift weapons at the ready. The Zorgons were caught off guard. Laros led the charge, her stolen blaster cutting down guards left and right. They fought their way through twisting corridors, leaving a trail of Zorgon corpses in their wake. Laros kicked down the door to the interrogation chamber. Carl hung limply from his chains, but his eyes blazed with defiance. She rushed to him, blasting his restraints. "Took you long enough," Carl grunted as Laros caught him. She pressed a blaster into his hand. "Think you can still fight?" Carl's fingers tightened around the weapon. "Watch me." They battled their way out of the base, Carl's expert marksmanship dropping Zorgons with every shot despite his injuries. As they emerged into the open, Carl raised his voice. "Romulans, the time to take back your world is now." A cheer went up from the resistance fighters. They surged forward, newfound courage driving them on. In space, Jake's ship maneuvered alongside the Zorgon flagship. "Boarding teams, go!" Jake led the assault himself, cutting through Zorgon defenders with his vibroblade. On the bridge, he came face to face with the Zorgon leader. "Your reign of terror ends here," Jake snarled. The two clashed in a brutal duel, Jake's human speed and skill were evenly matched against the Zorgon's raw strength. But in the end, Jake's blade found its mark, plunging into the alien's chest. With their leader dead and flagship crippled, the Zorgon fleet fell into chaos. Jake's voice rang out over the comms. "Press the attack! Don't let up!" On the ground, Karl, Laros, and the Resistance pushed the Zorgons back block by block, city by city. The aliens' once unbreakable will to conquer crumbled in the face of Romulan dedication and human firepower. As the last Zorgon warship exploded in orbit, Karl received an urgent transmission. His face darkened as he listened. "Laros," he said grimly. "There's a group of your people being held in a temple. They're going to be sacrificed." Laros' eyes widened in horror. "We have to stop them." They raced to the temple, a fortified structure on the outskirts of the capital. Karl and Laros led a small team inside, fighting through fanatical Zorgon priests. In the central chamber, they found a group of terrified Romulan women and girls surrounded by chanting Zorgons. Karl's blaster barked, dropping the head priest mid-incantation. "It's over," Karl growled at the remaining Zorgons. "Surrender or die." The battle that followed was short and brutal. When it ended, Karl and Laros stood victorious among the fallen Zorgons, the rescued captives clinging to them in tearful gratitude. As the dust settled, the full extent of their victory became clear. The Zorgon threat was eliminated, and Romulus was free. Crowds of Romulans filled the streets, cheering the humans who had saved them. In a makeshift command center, Laros approached Karl and Jake. "You've given us back our world," she said. "Stay. Make Romulus your home." Karl shook his head, a wistful smile on his face. "There are other worlds out there that need help, other innocents to protect." As the mercenary fleet prepared to depart, Karl stood on the bridge of Jake's ship. He gazed out at the stars, each one a potential new adventure, a new fight against the darkness that threatened the galaxy. "Where to next, boss?" Jake asked. Karl's eyes gleamed with purpose. "Wherever we're needed. Let's go." Karl and his crew barely had time to catch their breath on Romulus before a new crisis erupted. As they lounged in a makeshift bar, swapping stories over drinks, Laros burst in, her face tight with worry. "Karl, we need your help. There's been an uprising on one of our colony worlds." Karl set down his glass, instantly alert. "What's the situation?" Laros's words spilled out in a rush. "Separatists have taken control. They're holding hundreds of civilians hostage, women and children. If their demands aren't met, they'll kill them all." Jake leaned forward, brow furrowed. "The Romulan military can't handle this?" Laros shook her head. "Not fast enough, not without massive casualties." Karl stood, his heart made. "We'll take care of it. Jake, prep half the fleet for blockade duty. I'll lead a strike team to free the hostages." As Jake headed out to rally the ships, Karl assembled his team. He handpicked the best of his mercenaries, along with the most promising Romulan trainees. In the armory, they geared up in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the mission ahead. Hours later, under cover of darkness, Karl's team slipped past the rebel patrols and into the colony's capital. They moved like ghosts through empty streets, communicating only in hand signals. At last, they reached their target, a domed building that had once been a cultural center, now serving as a makeshift prison. Karl's scouts returned with grim reports of the conditions inside. "It's bad in there, boss," one whispered. "Guards everywhere, hostages crammed into every room." Karl nodded, his mind racing through tactical options. "All right, listen up. We hit them from multiple angles. Teams of 2, room by room. Jake's ships will start their attack run on the rebel leadership in exactly 30 minutes. That's our signal to move." The team spread out, taking up positions around the building. Karl checked his chronometer, counting down the seconds. When Jake's first salvo lit up the night sky, Karl gave the order. "Go, go, go!" They breached the building from all sides. Karl and Laros burst through a side door, immediately engaging 2 surprised guards. Carl's fist connected with one guard's jaw, while Laros's knife found the other's throat. They fought their way deeper into the complex, the sounds of combat echoing from every direction. In one room, they found a group of terrified Romulan children huddled together. "It's okay," Laros said softly in their language. "We're here to help." As they escorted the children out, an explosion rocked the building. Jake's orbital bombardment was intensifying, sowing chaos among the rebels. Room by room, corridor by corridor, Carl's team pushed forward. They encountered fierce resistance, but the rebels were disorganized and outmatched. Carl lost count of how many he took down, each one just another obstacle between him and the innocents who needed saving. Finally, they reached the central atrium. The remaining rebels had gathered there, using the last of the hostages as human shields. Their leader, a scarred Romulan with wild eyes, held a disruptor to a young woman's head. "Stay back," he shouted, "or I'll kill them all." Carl saw the fear in the hostages' eyes, the desperation of the cornered rebels. He knew there was only one way this could end without a bloodbath. Slowly, deliberately, he set down his weapon and stepped into the open. "Take me instead," he said calmly. "Let them go, and you can have me." The rebel leader's eyes widened. "The human? You'd sacrifice yourself for these people?" Carl nodded. "That's the deal, me for them. What do you say?" For a long moment, the atrium was silent. Then the rebel leader grinned. "Very well. Come here, human." As Carl approached, hands raised, the rebels began releasing their hostages. Laros and the others quickly ushered them to safety. The moment the last civilian was clear, Carl struck. His hidden blade flashed out, burying itself in the rebel leader's chest. In the same instant, Carl's team opened fire, cutting down the stunned rebels before they could react. In seconds, it was over. Carl stood among the fallen rebels, breathing heavily. Outside, he could hear the cheers of the liberated colonists. As they emerged from the building, a crowd gathered. Wide-eyed Romulan children pushed forward, reaching out to touch the humans who had saved them. Carl knelt down, letting them see he was flesh and blood, just like them. "Thank you," one small girl said shyly. "You're heroes." Carl managed a tired smile. "We just did what was right," he said. But even as he accepted their gratitude, his mind was already turning to the next mission, the next world that might need their help. There would always be another fight, another chance to make a difference. Carl's muscles ached as he slumped into the pilot's seat of the mercenary shuttle. The adrenaline from the Romulan colony mission still surged through his veins. He rubbed his eyes, fighting off exhaustion. A sharp beep cut through the quiet. Carl's head snapped up, instantly alert. He scanned the console, fingers flying over the controls. "Shit," he muttered. "Jake, get in here." Jake burst into the cockpit seconds later. "What is it, boss?" Carl's face was grim. "Distress signal, remote Romulan outpost, pirates." Jake's eyes widened. "Casualties?" "Unknown, but there are cadets trapped inside, female cadets." Jake swore under his breath. Carl punched in coordinates, the engines humming to life. "Rally the team," Carl ordered. "We move now." Minutes later, the shuttle rocketed through space at maximum warp. In the cargo hold, Carl briefed his strike team, a dozen of his most hardened fighters. "We go in hot," he said. "No mercy for slavers." The men nodded, faces set with cold fury as they checked their weapons. As they dropped out of warp, the outpost came into view. A sprawling facility on a barren moon. Explosions dotted its surface. Pirate ships swarmed around it like angry hornets. Carl gripped the controls. "Weapons free! Light 'em up!" The shuttle's guns roared to life, strafing the pirate forces. Carl's expert piloting sent them screaming over the outpost in a series of bone-jarring attack runs. "Breach team, go!" Carl shouted. 5 mercenaries leapt from the shuttle, repelling lines playing out behind them. They hit the outpost's surface running, plasma rifles spitting death. Carl brought the shuttle in low, touching down amid the chaos. He sprinted down the ramp, the rest of the team fanning out around him. Laser fire crackled through the air. Carl dove behind a wrecked speeder, popping up to drop two pirates with precise headshots. They fought their way inside, the corridors littered with debris and bodies. Carl's assault rifle never stopped firing as they cleared room after room. Finally, they reached a sealed blast door. Carl pressed his ear against it, hearing muffled whimpers from inside. "This is it," he said. "Stack up." Just as they prepared to breach, a massive explosion rocked the facility. The blast door buckled inward with a screech of tortured metal. Pirate shock troops poured through the gap. Carl's team opened fire, but the pirates kept coming. "Protect the cadets," Carl roared. He charged forward, slamming the butt of his rifle into a pirate's face. All around him, his men engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Carl's fists and feet were a blur as he fought. A pirate's vibroblade slashed his arm. Carl grabbed the man's wrist, twisting until bones snapped. He seized the fallen blade, driving it into another attacker's throat. One by one, the pirates fell. Carl stood panting, surrounded by broken bodies. Only the pirate captain remained, holding a young Romulan woman in front of him like a shield. "Back off, human!" the pirate snarled, "or I'll gut her!" Carl's eyes locked with the terrified cadet. He saw the blade pressing against her throat, drawing a trickle of green blood. In that moment, Carl made his choice. He lunged forward faster than seemed possible. The pirate's blade slashed down, but Carl was already inside his guard. Carl's hands clamped around the pirate's head. With a savage twist, he snapped the man's neck. The cadet stumbled free as her captor crumpled to the floor. Silence fell. Carl looked around at the shaken cadets, the burning outpost, his blood-spattered men. "Let's get you out of here," he said softly. As the dust settled on Romulus, Carl's communicator crackled to life. Laros's voice came through, tense and urgent. "Carl, we need you. A research outpost has gone dark near the edge of our space." Carl's eyes narrowed. "What kind of research?" "Classified," Laros replied. "But it's vital to our defense against future threats. We fear the worst." Within hours, Carl had assembled his top team. Jake Steele stood at his side as their ship cut through the void towards the outpost's coordinates. As they approached, an eerie silence greeted them. No chatter on comms, no defense systems activating. Carl's grip tightened on his rifle. "Stay sharp," he muttered as they docked. The airlock hissed open. Carl took point, boots clanking on metal grates. Emergency lights flickered, casting long shadows. The team moved in formation, weapons raised. They found the first body in the main corridor, a Romulan scientist. Chest cavity burst open from the inside. Green blood pooled beneath him. "What the hell did this?" Jake whispered. Deeper in the facility, they uncovered holding cells. The reinforced doors hung open, twisted and warped. Claw marks scored the walls. Carl crouched, examining a discarded datapad. His face paled as he read. They were experimenting on some kind of alien species. Xenomorphs. Acid for blood. A low hiss echoed through the vents. Motion detectors lit up. "Contact!" a mercenary shouted. A blur of black chitin dropped from the ceiling. Razor-sharp claws tore through body armor effortlessly. Screams filled the air as more xenomorphs swarmed from hidden passages. Carl fired in controlled bursts, each shot finding its mark. But for every alien that fell, two more took its place. "Fall back," Carl ordered. "Jake, what's your status?" Static crackled. Then Jake's voice came through. "Carl, I'm in the reactor room. You need to see this." Carl fought his way through twisting corridors, leaving a trail of alien corpses in his wake. He found Jake staring at a pulsating mass of eggs. "It's a breeding chamber," Jake said, "about to hatch." Carl's mind raced. There was only one option. "We have to overload the reactor. It's the only way to contain this." Jake nodded grimly. "I'll hold them here. You get to the control room." Carl clasped Jake's shoulder, then turned to face the gauntlet ahead. He sprinted down corridors slick with blood and acid, dodging alien attacks from all sides. Finally, the control room door loomed before him. Carl slammed the emergency locks, buying precious seconds. He rushed to the reactor controls, fingers flying over the keyboard. Warning klaxons blared as he initiated the overload sequence. A thunderous crash shook the room. Carl spun, heart pounding. The xenomorph queen towered over him, jaws dripping with corrosive saliva. Its massive tail lashed out, slamming Carl to the ground. Carl's radio crackled. Jake's voice, tight with pain. "Carl! I see you on the monitors! The queen—" "Do it, Jake!" Carl roared, grappling with the monstrous alien. "Blow it all to hell!" The room shook as explosions ripped through the facility. Carl and the queen tumbled as the floor gave way. Buried under rubble, Carl fought with desperate strength. His fingers found a jagged piece of metal. He drove it into the queen's skull again and again as nuclear fire consumed them both. In the evacuation shuttle, Jake and the survivors listened in horror to Carl's final transmission. A scream of defiance, cut short by inhuman screeches. Then silence. Silence fell. Days turned to weeks. The mercenary team, battered and diminished, prepared to depart Romulus. Jake stood before Laros and the Romulan leadership, his face haggard. "Carl Bailey gave his life to stop the xenomorph threat," Jake reported, his voice hoarse. "We couldn't recover his body." Laros bowed his head. He died as he lived, protecting others. As Jake turned to leave, a young technician burst into the room. "Sir, we've detected a signal." Jake spun around. "What kind of signal?" The technician's eyes were wide. "A distress beacon from an uncharted moon. It's Carl's emergency transponder." Jake's heart raced. "Prep the ship, now!" Hours later, their vessel screamed towards the barren moon. Jake peered through the view screen, searching the rocky landscape. "There!" he shouted, pointing to a twisted piece of metal half buried in the dust. They touched down hard. Jake was first out the airlock, bounding across the airless surface. He reached the battered escape pod, his gloved hands scrabbling at the sealed hatch. "Cutting charges," he barked into his comm. "Stand clear." The explosion ripped the hatch free. Jake peered inside, his helmet light illuminating the pod's interior. His breath caught in his throat. Carl lay there, barely recognizable. His suit was torn and scorched, crusted with blood both red and acidic green, but his chest still rose and fell with shallow breaths. Jake's hands shook as he checked Carl's vitals. "He's alive," he breathed. "God knows how." Carl's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Jake with effort. Took you long enough," he wheezed. "What happened?" Jake asked, working to stabilize his friend. Carl coughed weakly. "Queen nearly got me. Grabbed a pod just before the reactor blew. Systems fried on entry. Been rationing. Air. Activated beacon. When I thought it was over." Jake's medic rushed forward, administering emergency treatment. "We need to evac now," he said urgently. "He's lost a lot of blood." Suddenly, alarms blared from their ship. Jake's comm crackled. "Boss, we've got company! Orion pirate vessel on approach, fast!" Jake swore. He looked at Carl, then at the med team. "How long to prep him for transport?" The medic shook his head. "At least 20 minutes. Moving him now could kill him." Jake made a quick decision. "Carver, you and your team stay with Carl, the rest of you with me. We're going to give these pirates a welcome they won't forget." They took up positions among the moon's craggy boulders. The pirate ship swooped low, kicking up plumes of gray dust as it landed. Jake watched through his scope as the airlock cycled open. A dozen pirates emerged, weapons drawn. "Wait for my signal," Jake murmured. The pirates spread out, moving cautiously towards the escape pod. Jake let them get halfway there. "Now." The mercenaries opened fire. Plasma bolts lit up the airless void. 2 pirates went down immediately, their suits rupturing in gouts of frozen blood. The others dove for cover, returning fire. Jake rolled to avoid a barrage of energy blasts, then popped up to drop another pirate with a clean headshot. The battle raged across the lunar surface. Jake's team fought with desperate intensity, knowing Carl's life hung in the balance. One by one, the pirates fell. Finally, only the pirate captain remained. He threw down his weapon, hands raised in surrender. Jake approached cautiously, rifle trained on the alien's head. "Please," the pirate begged. "Mercy." Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. Then he lowered his weapon. "Get off this moon," he growled, "and spread the word. This sector is under our protection now." The pirate scrambled back to his ship. Jake watched it streak away, then turned back towards the pod. His heart sank as he saw Carver emerge, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, boss," Carver said softly. "We lost him." Jake's shoulders slumped. He walked slowly to the pod, gazing down at Carl's still form. Even in death, his friend's face was set with fierce tenacity. They brought Carl's body back to Romulus. The funeral was held at the edge of Romulan space, attended by battle-hardened mercenaries and wide-eyed Romulan cadets alike. As Carl's body drifted into the star-flecked void, Jake spoke. "Carl Bailey was the best of us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He never stopped fighting for what was right. His sacrifice saved countless lives." Jake looked out at the assembled cadets, seeing the tears on their young faces. "Remember him," Jake said. "Remember his courage, and carry it with you always." The mercenaries departed soon after, off to face new dangers in the vastness of space. But Carl's legacy remained, a beacon of hope and inspiration for a new generation of Romulan defenders. Jake stood at the helm of their ship, staring out at the stars. He thought of Carl, of all they'd been through together, and Jake stood at the helm of their ship, staring out at the stars. He thought of Carl, of all they'd been through together. And then his reverie was shattered by the urgent beeping of an incoming transmission. "Jake, we've got a situation." Laros's voice crackled through the comm. "A group of our female officer candidates are trapped on an asteroid training camp. Nausicaan raiders are closing in fast." Jake's heart made. "How many?" 24 cadets plus their instructor. The Nausicaans want to sell them as slaves. We have no one else in range." "We're on it," Jake said, cutting the transmission. He strode into the ship's common area, where Carl's former lieutenants were gathered. "Gear up. We've got work to do." Within minutes, they were aboard a combat shuttle, rocketing towards the asteroid. Radar screens lit up with incoming Nausicaan vessels. "Hold on!" Jake shouted as he initiated a steep dive. The shuttle's guns blazed, strafing the lead Nausicaan ships. Explosions blossomed in the void as the raiders scattered. Jake brought the shuttle down hard on the asteroid's surface, kicking up a cloud of gray dust. As it settled, they saw a grizzled Romulan emerge from a nearby bunker. "About time someone showed up," the old instructor growled. "We're in deep shit here." Inside the bunker, Jake surveyed the grim faces of the young Romulan women. Fear warred with perseverance in their eyes. "All right, listen up," Jake said. "We're getting you out of here. Half my team will escort you to the extraction point. The rest of us are going to give those Nausicaan bastards something to think about." As night fell on the asteroid, Jake led his strike team out into the rocky terrain. The air crackled with energy weapon fire as they engaged the Nausicaan boarding parties. Jake ducked behind a boulder, plasma bolts sizzling past his head. He popped up, dropping 2 raiders with quick bursts from his rifle. "They're flanking us," one of his men shouted. Jake saw the Nausicaans advancing, their leering grins visible even at a distance. He clicked his comm. "Carver, status on the evac?" "Almost to the extraction point, boss," came the reply. "But we're running out of time." Jake made a snap decision. "New plan. We're going to level this whole damn rock. Get those cadets to the shuttle and prep for immediate dust-off." Suddenly, the night lit up with searing blue light. Massive ion beams lanced out from the camp's defense cannons, scything through the Nausicaan forces. "What the hell?" Jake muttered. His comm crackled. It was the old instructor, his voice strained. "Giving you boys a fighting chance. Now get those cadets out of here." Jake and his team sprinted for the extraction zone, taking advantage of the chaos. They reached the shuttle just as Carver was loading the last of the cadets aboard. "Everyone in!" Jake shouted. "We're leaving!" The shuttle's engines roared to life. They lifted off, streaking for orbit. For a moment, Jake allowed himself to hope they'd made it. Then alarms blared. A blinding flash erupted from the Nausicaan flagship. The shuttle rocked violently as something impacted their hull. "We're hit," the pilot yelled. "Controls aren't responding." Jake braced himself as the asteroid's surface rushed up to meet them. The shuttle slammed down hard, skidding across the rocky ground before coming to a stop. Dazed, Jake pulled himself from the wreckage. All around him, mercenaries and cadets stumbled out of the downed shuttle. In the distance, he could see Nausicaan drop ships descending. Jake hefted his rifle, checking the charge. He looked at the frightened faces of the young Romulan women, then at his battered team. "Form a perimeter," he ordered. "We hold this position until help arrives or we go down fighting." As the Nausicaans closed in, Jake thought again of Carl. He'd given everything to protect the innocent. Now it was Jake's turn to do the same. The first wave of raiders appeared over a nearby ridge. Jake sighted down his rifle, finger tightening on the trigger. The final stand was about to begin. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger as the first wave of Nausicaan raiders crested the ridge. The air crackled with plasma fire, forcing the mercenaries and cadets to duck behind their makeshift barricades. Suddenly, the night sky lit up with brilliant flashes. Streaks of green energy lanced down from orbit, hammering the Nausicaan positions. Jake's comm unit erupted with chatter. "This is Admiral Tavarin of the Romulan Defense Fleet. We've detected your distress call and are moving to engage the hostile forces." Jake allowed himself a grim smile. "Carver, pass the word. We're about to turn this fight around." As the orbital barrage intensified, Jake saw his chance. He grabbed a nearby cadet, shouting over the din of battle. "Fix bayonets! We're going in close!" The mercenaries snapped their blades into place. Jake vaulted over the barricade, roaring, "Charge!" Human and Romulan alike surged forward across the rocky ground. Jake's boots pounded the asteroid's surface as he closed the gap. The first Nausicaan loomed before him, caught off guard by the sudden assault. Jake's bayonet plunged deep into the alien's chest. All around him, the melee erupted into savage violence. Steel clashed against Nausicaan blades. Jake ducked under a wild swing, bringing his rifle butt up into his attacker's jaw with a sickening crunch. A scream to his left caught Jake's attention. One of the cadets was pinned down by a massive Nausicaan. Without hesitation, Jake charged, tackling the alien off the young Romulan. They hit the ground hard, Jake's rifle skittering away. The Nausicaan's fist caught Jake in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. He rolled, narrowly avoiding a vicious downward stab. Jake's hand found a jagged rock. He swung with all his might, feeling bone give way as it connected with the Nausicaan's skull. Jake staggered to his feet, retrieving his weapon. The battle raged on all sides. To his surprise, he saw the cadets holding their own, fighting with a ferocity born of desperation. A deafening roar drowned out the sounds of combat. Jake spun to see a blinding flash erupt from the Nausicaan landing zone. The old instructor stood there, arm outstretched, as nuclear fire consumed him and the enemy reinforcements. "Fall back," Jake bellowed. "Regroup with the Romulan troops." They retreated in good order, Jake providing covering fire as they linked up with the advancing Romulan soldiers. A Romulan general approached, and Jake quickly briefed him on the situation. As the battle shifted in their favor, two of Jake's wounded mercenaries approached. "Boss, we've got an idea. That Nausicaan flagship is still coordinating their forces. We can take it out." Jake studied their faces, seeing the stubborn persistence there. He nodded. "Do it." The two men clasped hands before sprinting towards the enemy lines. Jake watched them go, a lump forming in his throat. Hours later, as the last pockets of Nausicaan resistance were mopped up, Jake stood aboard the Romulan flagship. He gazed out at the asteroid field, littered with the wreckage of the battle. A Romulan officer approached. "The cadets are safely aboard, sir. We're ready to depart." Jake nodded, his mind already racing. "Get me a secure channel. It's time to call in some old debts." As the Romulan fleet prepared to jump to warp, Jake recorded his message. "Attention all independent operators. This is Jake Steele. Carl Bailey gave his life to protect the innocent. Now it's our turn. The Nausicaans are on the run, but they're still out there. Who's with me? Jake ended the transmission, his eyes hard as he stared out at the stars. The real war was just beginning. Jake's message echoed through the void, reaching countless independent operators across the sector. But there was no time to wait for reinforcements. The Romulan warbird's sensors blared to life, detecting a massive energy signature in a nearby nebula. "We've got company," Carver growled, studying the readouts. "Nausicaan signatures, lots of them." Jake leaned over the console, his face hardening as he saw the sheer number of hostile ships. "How many?" "Over 100 vessels," the Romulan tactical officer reported, her voice tight. "They outgun us significantly." Admiral Taverin strode onto the bridge, her eyes blazing. "The cowards called for help before we jammed their communications. Now they seek vengeance against Romulus itself." Jake's fists clenched. "We can't let them reach the planet. There are millions of civilians down there." "Agreed," Taverin nodded. "But our forces are limited. We need time to evacuate and fortify our defenses." Jake turned to his mercenaries, seeing the same relentless drive in their eyes. "We'll buy you that time," he said. "Split our forces. Half to reinforce your orbital platforms, the rest with me on the surface." The Admiral hesitated, then nodded sharply. "Very well. We'll begin evacuations immediately." As the Romulan ships raced towards their homeworld, Jake briefed his team. "This is going to be ugly," he said bluntly. "We're outnumbered and outgunned, but we're all that stands between those Nausicaan bastards and millions of innocent lives." The mercenaries nodded, checking their weapons with practiced efficiency. Jake continued, "Carver, you take half the team to the defense platforms. Hold them off as long as you can. The rest of you are with me. We'll set up a kill zone in the city ruins." As they approached Romulus, Jake saw massive energy shields flickering to life around population centers. Streams of evacuation ships poured from the surface, racing for safety. Jake's team touched down in an abandoned city sector, the once gleaming towers now reduced to rubble. He directed his forces to take up positions, creating overlapping fields of fire through the maze-like ruins. The young Romulan cadets moved with purpose, their earlier fear replaced by cold fury. Jake nodded approvingly. They'd need that anger to survive what was coming. Suddenly, the sky lit up with searing flashes. The orbital battle had begun. Jake activated his comm. "Carver, status?" "It's a bloodbath up here, boss," Carver's voice crackled. "We're giving them hell, but there's just too damn many." Jake's eyes narrowed as he saw fiery streaks descending through the atmosphere. "Incoming! Brace for impact!" The ground shook as Nausicaan drop pods slammed into the city. Hatches burst open, disgorging waves of heavily armed pirates. Jake hefted his rifle. "Light 'em up!" The air filled with plasma fire as the mercenaries and cadets opened up from their concealed positions. Nausicaans fell by the dozens, but more kept coming. Jake ducked behind a fallen pillar as return fire chewed through the rubble around him. He popped up, dropping 3 pirates with quick bursts. "They're flanking us!" a cadet shouted. Jake spun to see Nausicaans pouring through a collapsed building. "Fall back!" Jake roared. "Secondary positions!" They retreated deeper into the ruins, trading fire every step of the way. Jake's forces were dwindling, but they made the Nausicaans pay dearly for every meter. Hours passed in a blur of brutal close-quarters combat. Jake lost track of how many times they fell back, always extracting a heavy toll from the pirates. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the area. Jake found himself pinned beneath the collapsed remains of an overpass. He could hear the cadets fighting desperately to reach him. As Jake struggled to free himself, he saw a towering Nausicaan commander approaching, flanked by elite guards. The alien sneered down at him. "Your pathetic resistance ends here, human." Jake's hand found the detonator in his pocket. He grinned up at the Nausicaan, blood staining his teeth. "You're right about one thing. It ends here." The cadets finally broke through, weapons raised. Jake met their eyes one last time, seeing the shock as they realized what he was about to do. Jake looked back at the Nausicaan commander. "Go tell your people," he snarled. "If you ever threaten innocence again, humanity will be waiting." His thumb pressed down on the detonator. For a moment, the world went white.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.